So it's 3M only. It's not Minnesota
Yeah.
Manufacturing and Mining. Okay. Now I used to work with the derivative of IDS, which turned into Ameriprise, and the headquarters was there in Minneapolis, and
Yeah.
that was one of the jokes. As an East Coaster, I didn't think it was so funny, but whatever.
There are a lot of jokes coming from that place, but that's another story.
Yeah, offline.
Hey,
So
Dr. Cooper, I want to get in your background about how you came across one, the OODA Loop. I know that you're familiar with Scrum. You're very familiar with Lean. You understand team science. You've looked at crew resource management and team steps. But just give us some background on how you came across John Boyd's OODA Loop and how you apply it.
Sure. So, in addition to my medical background, I have a fairly extensive flying background. It's all civilian, but it's everything from aerobatic to doing BFM and ACM with active military folks at Nellis and such, and actually went to work consulting with a company called LifeWings. That was a spinoff of CTI, Steve Harden and Al Mullins group. And we were teaching CRM and aviation based safety to healthcare. And so I wrote about the similarities between my flying, the operating room, and was doing and have continued to do a very in-depth study of leadership, of decision making, of how you optimize performance and continue to do so. And came across John Boyd, first Quorum's book, and then read everything I could, and then read most of the commentary I could find. And so, for me, it resonated immediately and continues to do so. And sometimes, it's it's surprising and a little frustrating sometimes. You have to communicate to people when, for me, it was intuitive and resonant. And so I see daily, probably like you gents do, opportunities where this makes sense, where this has value.
Shockingly, you've done some work with 3M. When I started working with Jeff Sutherland, they were doing a lot of work with 3M at that time, and that's kind of how I met Nigel Thurlow. Lean is connected to John Boyd's OODA Loop through the Toyota production system, and then you get into Scrum and Jeff Sutherland's interpretation of the OODA Loop, which is built around, how he developed Scrum or co-developed Scrum through the OODA Loop. He also claims that it's connected to the Toyota production system, which we now say that they're one and the same. So I want to get your thoughts when you started applying these concepts to, from the cockpit to the healthcare industry, maybe into surgical teams. What didn't work for you? What wasn't working for you when you brought that information over?
So, first of all, you have to take the time to develop the culture. And by that, I mean there's a maturity that allows you to be objective and constructively critical. And unless you take the time to develop the maturity in the system, then it's not going to be successful. It's not going to go over well. And I can give you an example. I mean, early on, I implemented performance debriefs in the operating room. In the traditional way, you let the most junior people, you tell everybody what they did well, and then you let the most junior people speak first so that you don't inhibit or shut down the conversations. But when it got to being what I thought was constructively critical, so that we got better for the next iteration, I had people crying leaving the room. And so I had to take a step back and say, okay, I need to do more behind the scenes work so that they understand. And I think one of the things, and maybe we'll get into, is the difference between civilian life and the military. And I think civilian leadership is just catching up with this business of humility and credibility in order to establish trust.
Yeah.
And I think this civilian side is way behind where the military has institutionalized that much earlier. And I think trust is the foundation of almost anything you want to do. So however you can to establish the trust, the openness, that you're as liable to error and need the input as the rest of the team, then that allows you to then iterate and become better. And so that was certainly the case. And I found that.
We've had some doctors on the show who implemented aviation crew resource management into their surgical teams. We've also had Dr. Eduardo Salas, who was one of the creators of the crew resource management, who went on to develop team steps. But I want to unpack your point about making people cry in a debrief, because I've done that, not on purpose, but by really following a structured debrief process and without taking people through what we call team development intervention, like actually taking them through a simulation or taking them out of their world and to show them how to communicate, show them how to do these basic things. The problem I ran into about 10 years ago is when I led with debriefing, they didn't know a lot of things underneath it, right? The humility, how to be accountable. We give them a nice structure. We take them through that, have them reconstruct the past, what happened, which most people can't do. They can't even do in a 10-minute simulation they do with us sometimes. It actually gets better when we help them out and build that situational awareness. But I want to go back to that time when you were applying what I'll call effective debriefing. And what are your, what lessons did you take out of that? What would you get right about it? What did you get wrong about it? How would you do it again in the future?
Well, if I had to do it again, I'd go slower, and I'd start with maybe the algorithm was you start with the junior folks, but maybe it's better to start with yourself and say, "Hey, I screwed up," or "I need to be better," and open yourself up and show your own vulnerability, but also openness to improvement as a start. And you just have to keep trying. And there's some folks who are going to grasp it right away. There are others who aren't. But I think the other important point is, and I think most people see new things like this as, oh, this is something we're doing today, or this is the new flavor of the month. But the difference is, how do you integrate that into the culture of how we do things on a daily basis and throughout? And so it's not just doing it in the operating room or not just doing it in the ICU. I mean, when you think about it, we should be doing that in almost every endeavor. Every action, we should be doing an after action report, whatever you want to call it. And so how do you change culture? Well, that involves not just the rank and file. Leadership has to be out there actively showing that that's a priority.
All right. So you've worked with a lot of leaders in the past, and you brought up the point about humility, and that's actually, when we create psychological safety in an environment, it's a local construct. It's not something that can be gifted throughout the organization. It's something that leaders have to set the tone on, and that's one thing we show folks how to do with effective debriefing. And in your experience, can you kind of walk us through why leaders push back on this? We'll call it the woo of teams, right? The woo of leadership, which is fundamental to things like team steps and crew resource management and what we teach within the Flow Learning Lab. But why do leaders push back on implementing these things?
Well, I think it starts with their own insecurity, their own lack of maturity, their own amnesia about where they once were. And I think those things get together. They forget when they were in a similar position, and they think that they're now, in some cases, not all cultures are the same. There are some great cultures out there, but when it doesn't work, the leadership forgets where they've come from. They think they're invulnerable. They manifest their insecurities. For a surgeon, for example, you say that surgeons do things the way they were trained in residency, but the sign of a mature surgeon, like in other enterprises, is to know when to evolve, when to do things differently. That's a sign of maturity, right? And I think it's the same thing with leadership as well.
You talk a little bit about ego, and maybe there's actually some interesting research. I don't have it in front of me right now, but it's like having a lobotomy. When you become a leader, you forget that, going back to your point, who you were, where you came from, that you sometimes just do not take information from the outside. If it's somebody junior in your organization or what have you. In fact, many people go out and get external coaches, and they want to be one-on-one with them. They treat them differently than they would their own peers. But can you talk a little bit about ego in an operating room and maybe even the cockpit, the similarities and dangers of both?
Yeah, so we all have egos, and like fighter pilots who think that they're all handsome but not all tall, I think you said. But we all want to be, I think, at some level, the captain of the ship. And years ago, it was true that in the cardiac operating room, the cardiac surgeon was the captain of the ship. But the reality is that culture's evolved. I think we've learned that it's better to bring in the shared awareness of what's going on, as well as what might go wrong or what might go awry. And so I think we've developed more of a balance. So sometimes you do have to put your ego in check. However, sometimes you do have to be assertive. It's not always the time for debate or discussion. Sometimes there are decisions in time critical situations that are black and white. You don't always get them right because you don't always and frequently you don't have optimal information. And so part of the learning, the long apprenticeship, maybe it's lifelong, is to know when to assert that a decision has to be made. And sometimes you have to do that against other opinion, against adversity. And that is
Yeah.
perhaps a manifestation of ego, but you got to balance it.
I'm curious, as you came across John Boyd's work, I'm sure you came across Mission Command, and you just brought up the point that sometimes a leader in an organization has to make a decision, have 51% of the vote. But can you kind of is there a connection in your mind between what you see, one, in the cockpit, two, in operating rooms, and then any connection to what you see through Mission Command?
Yeah, a couple of things. I think the similarities exist in terms of being so well trained
Mhm.
that the commonplace doesn't take your full attention. If it's in the operating room, it means you're trained, but the team is trained also, so that when something different happens, you can concentrate on what's different. In the cockpit, they teach pilots that when things are quiet, you should be thinking about the what ifs,
Mm-hmm.
right? Because things will go on. And in the operating room, for example, I did pediatric cardiac surgery as well, and the average pediatric cardiac operation had four errors that occurred, and the successful completion of the operation wasn't due to the skill of the surgeon. It was due to the awareness, the willingness to communicate of the team that pointed those out, and they were remedied.
Yeah.
And that's among the best teams. So again, that's the human value of team, the optimal performance value of team.
So I think there's something in there with threat and error management, and I wasn't expecting to go there, but since you brought up this, you're trapping something inside of a surgical or an operating room. What we mean by that is you trap the error. So errors come from you, threats come to you. I think that's how it works. So I want to rephrase this again. In the cockpit, I think in commercial airlines right now, there's I believe, I'm going to throw a number out there, I may be wrong, 7 errors that happen every time a crew goes flying. Meaning these things can get outside, they can create a bigger problem, but they trap them, and they trap them because of their teaming skills. The same thing sounds to be true in the operating room, and I'm certain the same thing is true on a software team or on a leadership team. Did you come across threat and error management from CRM, and is that where you're getting this idea from?
Yeah,
Okay,
absolutely, and I certainly saw it in the cockpit, but certainly in the operating room is more so. A lot of us flying aerobatic planes, it's single person CRM, but
yeah.
but certainly in a multi-person cockpit or a team, or certainly the operating room, there are multiple people involved.
Okay. No, this is great. So,
Yeah.
when we started our company years ago, we actually built it off of 3 things. It was aviation crew resource management, high reliability theory, and John Boyd's OODA Loop. And that was before we really understood complex adaptive systems. And fortunately, John Boyd looked at complex adaptive systems and pointed us to things like the Kinevin framework and wicked problems and things like that. Then high reliability theory connects to resilience engineering. It also connects to what is known today as human and organizational performance. So what we're suggesting, not only through this podcast, but what we deliver is when you look at these natural, I'm going to call them natural science approaches to how complex adaptive systems work, which we get through the mass observation of things like flight decks of aircraft carriers and submarines, and even operating rooms. You watch how these high performing teams operate. You can learn a lot from them. That compared to what I saw in the agile industry was a lot of pseudoscience, right? And we've had Alistair Coburn on the show to talk about, hey, years ago, the agile community went down the wrong path. They went down the pseudoscience path when they should have gone down the Carl Weick path, which is the high reliability theory, which is what we're kind of talking about here. So what we saw, or what I saw in the years of coaching agile, and maybe a little bit in the lean, is there's a lot of pseudoscience involved in that space. And what you're talking about is you basically borrow from what other high performing teams are doing and adapt those practices to your domain or your industry and move forward. So I want to get your thoughts on what you've seen I know you worked in the, a little bit in the agile space as well, but I want to get your perspective on what you saw there.
Well, that's Boyd's agility, right?
Mm-hmm.
The willingness to look outside, to change the processes that got you here, because they may no longer be the ones that you need today or for the future. That's a different agility from the agile Scrum. But obviously, as you know from working with Jeff, and I was at 3M, by the way, when Scrum Inc. came in, and that was their second exposure to Scrum, because the first one didn't take. But that's again another tangent. But I think that what you see is that's where most organizations struggle in the face of change. I know you guys like to talk about VUCA and such, but in the face of things, which certainly have happened with the pandemic or economic challenges, and for big companies that was certainly the case, that prompted spin-offs. It was a necessity to deal with that change in a different way than you have for the last 100 years. And the fact that they didn't do it, weren't willing to do that, were weaknesses, vulnerabilities in their culture that needed to change if they were smart.
Hey, Mark, I want you to unpack some of the things you're hearing from this conversation thus far.
I think what I really take away, and I got this out of your paper, and I rated a 10 out of 10, is the importance of orientation. That orientation shapes, and that orientation is also fractal, and it's also the OODA Loop sketch is an abstraction of how orientation functions. It shows how it shapes, and it's fractal at the individual and the team level. We just had a great conversation with Chet Richards about that. And I think you affirmed that. And you also talk about distributed decision-making and other things. And it says how orientation across a team can actually, as you're saying, enhance what it is. And I think that what I would ask you for the leaders that are listening, really narrow and drill down on that hard so that they understand, because even things like ego, I mean, that's part of our orientation, and we have the humility and the self-reflective powers to account for that. Our orientation gets stronger and stronger. And the other thing I would just add is that you have to constantly break and revise and update that orientation. And I think that that's kind of ties into what Panch was asking about, how when these leaders, why do they push back? Because they're incapable of breaking their models and revising them and updating them.
Right. And I think the other thing about orientation, because I absolutely agree, is that ideally is a shared phenomenon also, because you have this experiential issue, and again, back to Gary Klein a little bit with the recognition prime decision making. And I think that's real. And that's what distinguishes on the battlefield or in the operating room or in the cockpit the people who are experienced from the newbies. So how do you bring up the average level of performance to a safe level or better level, and ultimately to an elite level? You got to share that. And so that becomes then a shared consciousness, a shared orientation.
I was trying to think of the movie with Alec Baldwin and Nicole Kidman, where he's a surgeon and he says, "I am God."
Malice. I haven't
Malice.
seen the movie.
That's an example of an orientation that couldn't revise and update.
Well, so I'll give you a real example. I'm pretty modest about having been a surgeon, but it's not uncommon sometimes to have to go back to the operating room after a cardiac operation because of instability bleeding. So there was a fellow I operated on years ago, and he was unstable, he was bleeding. We had to take him back to the operating room at night, and we were doing CPR on the way to the operating room. We get the operating room, and the chief of anesthesia is doing the case. And he says, the patient's dead. And I said, he's not dead till I say he's dead. And he walked out of the operating room, and I saw him annually for years after. But that's some of the cases where you have to make a decision. Yeah. And maybe that's ego, maybe it's training, maybe it's experience, but sometimes it's not up for discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think it goes back to like anybody, and Boyd knew this because he did it till his death. You constantly have to revise and update your models because everything is in a constant state of flux. You can't statically know from your medical school days, because things have changed significantly since then. We had an argument I witnessed an argument the other day with someone on our Substack that was, when I say witness, I guess I was a participant, and pointed out 17 different logical fallacies. But what it was saying was, like, it was pinning something that Friedrich Hayek said in 1938. He died in 1992. He had a 54-year career after that one time in 1938. But all I had to do was what I pinpoint on that and inflexibly focus on that. And I think that what you're alluding to is what leaders do, or doctors do, or whatever. They pinpoint on something that they knew to be true, or they thought to be true, and they don't allow their orientation to be open, and they let the entropy settle in, because they don't realize that they have to constantly update and reorient their models. And that's the title of the Substack, is The World of Reorientation. And that's the title of the podcast. There's no way out of that if you want to thrive.
Right. But I think you've also discussed on the podcast where AI fits in. And I think that's where, in my mind, that's where augmented performance comes in. And that is, as human beings, we're limited. As the information that we need to evaluate becomes larger and larger, we're less well equipped because of our own limitations to do that, particularly incorporating new information and changing the direction of decision vectors. So AI can help. The question, it's the same thing in the military, right? The right information to the right person at the right time. So how do you know when the person's needing that information? DARPA's been doing a lot of studies on physiologic measurements, and then what information is it? How do you get it to them? We have analog brains, not digital. And there is some work going on converting information back to the analog to get it better to the brain. So
it seems like AI, well used, is an orientation enhancement for the human in the system, and for the team in the system. I think that the orientation on AI, people think it's going to replace my job, and I think that really the orientation that incorporates AI is going to replace the orientation that doesn't. I mean, I find the more that I interact with AI, the more I feel like I've known more about John Boyd than I ever did, of 30 years of manual study, with the ability to recall things quickly and to apply them fast. But I also was going to ask, what you think of this comment, and I've said it before on the show. I think now, maybe because of AI, maybe we could catch up to John Boyd.
Yeah. Well, I want to interject something there, Moose, and this is something that I just thought of over the weekend, and that is many pursuits for AI are to improve the linear observer-oriented side act cycle, the linear cycle. What I'm saying is we need to use the real OODA loop to improve artificial intelligence to help us improve human performance. And I think what's happening now with large language models is I'm going to use the language of the Cynefin framework here. They're targeting the ordered side of the framework, so the clear and complicated domains. Whereas humans being complex adaptive systems, and I think John Boyd's OODA loop does a great job. His real OODA loop does a very good job of explaining how those complex systems interact with the external world. The problem is we're using engineering approaches to try to enhance complex adaptive systems when we should take a complex adaptive system approach to maybe improve overall human performance, which includes that in the operating room. So I think we got to be cautious.
Would it be fair to say, Doctor, the example that you painted of he's dead? No, he's not dead until I say he's dead, and you've been treating this guy now for years. It seems to me, as Ponch has just illuminated, that's the difference between a circular linear OODA loop with flowchart type thinking versus the actual OODA loop sketch where orientation shapes, it guides and controls what we see in something that's always unfolding and always evolving.
Right. And that's where AI is challenged, right? It's easy for AI in most cases to do structured data, but the unstructured data that we deal with all the time is what we really need to make the nuanced decisions. And I think then AI, again, as you've stated, beyond the linear, how does it bring in things beyond our ken so that we improve our decision making?
Yeah. So the application of AI into the operational room or operating room is happening now. But I also want to get your thoughts on how doctors are evolving to a change in reality that maybe the assumptions about how we're treated, in my view, let me just kind of reframe this. in my experience with doctors is they generally do not treat us as a complex adaptive system, that they look at us and try to break us down into a systems view, if you will, and try to target the root cause, which we know there's no root cause in a causal or in a complex adaptive system. There's causal factors. So this is kind of leading me to, do we have our assumptions wrong about how we should be treating humans, or does that need to evolve, or some thoughts on that?
Well, it's interesting because it makes me think about whether we all should have digital twins, um, and and predict failure modes and things like that and timing. And I think we will in the future. But I think there are a couple of things that have changed in medicine so that those questions may not be asked. They should be, but they're not being asked. And what has changed is, and you've probably all experienced it, hopefully minimally with your families, is medicine's very fragmented now. And it's hard to see who's the person who's steering the ship, who's the person who's got an overall situational awareness of all the aspects and is truly coordinating that. It used to be that docs and nurses would and their families would get great care in the system. Nowadays, everybody needs a navigator to get through so that you're getting coherent, integrated, common sense care. It's very fragmented. Things fall through the cracks. And I think if they start getting back to the basics, then that question can be reasonably asked. But I think we're far away from that, unfortunately.
It seems to go to the institutional mechanical nature versus the flowing complex adaptive system nature, where care providers, insurance companies or whatever, they're going to operate off of flow charts. They're not going to operate on the complexities. They're not going to allow for change. That the bureaucrat, because we know that orientation is fractal. That's a fractal orientation that's grown, and it's become a bureaucratic morass that's actually impeding progress or impeding effective treatment, impeding the system, the complex adaptive systems within it to flourish.
Right. I mean, you see it at all levels. You see it at the average primary care doc whose first concern is, I have 20 minutes or 10 minutes per patient. And I've got to do the documentation. So half the time I'm with you, I'm actually looking at the computer screen. And then you get to the third party payers and the insurance companies who don't really adopt the total cost of care view. They look at the incremental cost, when if they were smarter and looked at a broader integrated, more understanding of the complexity, as you've said, then in fact they could do better up front to decrease their total cost of care, which frankly their stockholders would like, but that's not how they think.
Yeah.
And that's where the entropy, it's like an entropy trap. I mean, it's like an entropy magnet, like bring us more entropy, because that's what's just going to happen, right?
Well, it's entropy, but it's got a financial incentive to them, right? Because the most complex patients fall off along the way. They get
that
lost
runs
in
out,
that
though.
journey.
That's what I'm saying. So that energy of capital or whatever is getting infused at some point, that runs out too, and everything crumbles apart, and the system breaks down.
Right, but frankly, to make it clear, patient who dies early in the hospitalization costs less than complex care.
It's one way to look at it. I mean, it's true though.
Yeah, right? It's not.
Wake up, everyone. But you're not saying doctors want you to die in a hospital, right? That's not...
No. Quite the opposite. But what I'm saying is we and very often the payers have the wrong perspective on the big picture of
that's
getting
the orientation misalignment.
Because we would all say that we want somebody to be as healthy and productive as long as they can be in their life.
Well, it's like we say all the time, like linear OODA will kill you, literally. Like it'll actually kill you. Like
So I want to unpack it. I wasn't expecting to go here either today on healthcare. However, if you look at us as complex adaptive systems again, what needs to change in healthcare, and how can the OODA Loop and the team science and situational awareness help change that for the better? In your thoughts?
So I think the orientation toward precision of what we deliver is important. So I think we can augment so first of all, take a step back. About 70% of a diagnosis when a patient comes to see you is based on the history. It's not based on testing or physical examination. But if you start to augment history with point of care testing, with the ability to say, okay, how do I compare the person sitting in front of me to the last 600 patients, propensity matched in a virtual cohort, then I get a step up in my ability to pinpoint their diagnosis. Once I've have an enhanced diagnosis, then I can do the same thing with a virtual cohort of how best to treat them with what best expected response rate. And so I can be precise for this individual. And so that takes into account an understanding of the complexity that's then manifested, but allows me to precisely apply the general base of knowledge to this particular individual. So I think that's where we're going to go. We're just scratching the surface of that right now.
So going through the cycle of destruction and creation is absolutely critical to improve.
Well, I think we've already been destroyed. Now we need to start putting it together.
Good point. So other aspects of applying, not just John Boyd's observer-oriented side ACT loop. You read a little bit about EM theory, but where else have you applied this type of thinking and found success or failure?
Well, I think one of the things that I take out of Boyd is speed, and the need for speed to maintain as he would say, a decisive advantage, right? And I think you see that all the time. Sometimes you are in a time critical situation, whether it's a patient, an airplane, battle, where you have to make a time critical decision. Very often you don't have complete information. However, I think you see the same thing in big companies who have to make strategic decisions, whether it's analysis paralysis or some other trait saying, you see that all the time, and they lose opportunity. And I've thought, well, why the hesitation? And I think part of the reason why sometimes individuals hesitate or bigger enterprises hesitate is they haven't defined who they are and where they're going. And I think part of it is, again, is a little bit of maybe it's the fingertip feel of understanding who you are, what your capabilities are, what they're not, but also defining to the agile, what does done look like? What's your goal out of this? And if that's clear, then I think it's easier to make a decision, a timely decision. If you haven't figured that out and you're just being responsive rather than proactive, I think you see that, and you see big companies fail because they're not able to make timely decisions.
I'm emphatically going to agree with everything that you just said. And I always say no essay, right? If you don't have because as you just said, if they don't know who they are, so no essay. If you don't have self-awareness, there's no way you can have situational awareness. Absolutely impossible. Your situational awareness is always going to suck if you have no self-awareness as an individual or as a team.
Yeah. I think that's one issue. The other thing that resonates for me out of Boyd's work is commander's intent. Again, something that's common to the military, not common in the civilian world. But I always think that if you're going to have distributed decision making, you have to share the information by which you make decisions. Well, that's antithetical to the hierarchies at some big organizations.
Oh yeah,
they don't want to share.
We didn't think you needed to know that. Why would you need to know that?
Right.
Yeah, that's
a
vulnerability.
Right, and it comes around full circle. Well, how do you expect people to buy in to what you're asking them to do and help in the decision making unless you give them the substrate?
Like that's the shared consciousness, the shared orientation. That's the fractal nature of and why it's imperative to understand OODA Loop sketch versus the linear engineered OODA Loop.
It gets back to go ahead. I'm sorry.
Go ahead. It gets back.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah. Well, it gets back to sort of where we started about culture. How do you get the individual to trust? A lot of the things we see is we attract talent, and then what do we do with talent? do we micromanage it to death to quiet quitting, or do we optimize and develop it so we get the most back from those individuals, even if they outgrow us?
That's the multiplier model, really. Like consciously attracting and nurture, as you say, attract, nurture, and value and retain.
Right. So I'm a big fan of Liz Weissman's multipliers. Yeah.
I love the paragraph where it starts off with the line, the Wyatt Earp, saying fast is fine, but accuracy is final. That goes back to the Schwerpunkt, right? That's the orientation. That
now,
speed.
It's hard to know whether he actually said that, but it's a pretty good quote, right?
Yeah, it's a great, even apocryphal. But I think the point is like when people think of speed, they often confuse with haste. You're talking about speed. You're talking about something deliberate with an orientation where the leader has an intent and it's distributed across the team, and there's a shared understanding because you're showing the fractal nature of orientation. And then as you go on in that exact paragraph, it's not how much you know or what you know that gives you the edge. It's how fast you can figure out what's going on and how you can respond to that and adapt to that.
Right. And it's reasonably intuitive that you need to be fast and precise or accurate, right?
So are you still flying, Doc? Are you doing any more flying?
I am.
And are you doing any aerobatics anymore? Or
so I'm in between aerobatic planes, but I've got a Thorpe T-18, a 2-seat experimental, which is still aerobatic, doing some stuff with that. But at some point, I hopefully get back to air shows.
So what air shows do you like? Where do you usually fly? Like, what have you done?
Well,
in the past?
so I had an extra 300 for years, and I think the biggest show I flew in, I flew at the Nellis Air Show years ago. So
wow.
I was part of the F-14 demo team, so I'd spent. I was the last instructor in the F-14 demo, and my body is paying for that now. I'll tell you that this 230-pound body got crushed around by pulling a lot of G's all day long.
Yeah, I'm sure.
We do back-to-back demonstrations when I was training the new crew. Fly down to Dare County, do an 18-minute show, fly back, hot pit, do it again, and no thanks. This body is there's a cost associated with doing air shows, and I'm finding out now. So how's your body holding up to the G's?
I'm okay, but I haven't done it as consistently as an active duty pilot.
No controlled crashes in the ships.
I still love it. No, I've had a near miss. I had a bit of FOD in my elevator coming out of a tumble, and I couldn't get the stick back at about 500 feet. And so, long story short, I used trim to get the nose up and power for altitude and managed to land.
Let's build on that. How did you know to do that? Did you ever train to that?
So I did. So that's the hangar flying.
Yeah.
And that's the what ifs.
Yeah.
And now thinking, a couple of things. I knew I had FOD that I hadn't found before the flight. So the first mistake I made was I shouldn't have done the flight. But having done that in the flight, I knew the trim authority and an extra was pretty significant. Couldn't get the stick back. I didn't think I had the altitude to roll inverted at that point, and so I used trim. So, but time does, and maybe you've experienced it. Probably time does slow down.
Yeah,
and that's what happened.
Yeah. Well, you're in a flow state there for sure. Trying to find some novelty to help you out there. So let's talk a little bit more about that. And we talk about flow quite a bit. We actually look at John Boyd's OODA Loop. When you put a boundary around it, it represents a flow system. So we're trying to optimize the currency that's flowing through it. What could be blood, it could be water, it could be information, energy, whatever the currency may be. But let's take that type of thinking, that flow thinking, back into that intuitive Fingerspitzengefühl approach inside of a team or organizations that's dealing with increased risk or uncertainty or even novelty in the environment. But I want to hear your thoughts on how organizations can leverage the power of flow. And again, it could be any construct of flow, from the lean side of the house to the Mihai Csikszentmihalyi side of the house. But I want to hear your thoughts on how to apply this type of flow thinking to performance.
I think there's a step before that, and that how do you get the folks you work with to be willing to listen, and who do they listen to? And and maybe it's off the subject a little bit, and maybe I'll come back full circle, maybe when I have a better answer. But um, I, companies and enterprises use consultants left or right, and a lot of the big consultants, in particular, take stuff off the shelf, and it doesn't really apply, and it's not really good. And yet, companies go back to that. And then sometimes companies, when you've worked with an organization for a while, you lose credibility just by virtue of being in that organization, and so they lose the resource of good ideas. So I think first you have to be persistent to get an ear, and sometimes you have to socialize that within an organization so that you can get a sufficient ear of people who are making decisions higher up the chain. And I think you just have to. It's not a precise science, and if you got a better way, I'm open to learn that. But you got to be banging on the door, showing people that there's value, there's something else to learn that they haven't conceived of,
Yeah.
and it's very and the result is very imprecise.
So unfortunately, I'm going to agree with you on this, or fortunately, however you want to look at it. Let me bring up some. We've done a lot of work with large organizations, and what we found is that middle managers that pick up on this, that pick up on these ideas, and they really become champions, it's insufficient for change in an organization. Unfortunately, one thing that Moose and I talk about now is, hey, look, if you're not an executive, I'm sorry, if you're an executive, you don't understand the OODA Loop, or you don't understand what we're saying, we don't want to work with you. If we have to spend a lot of time trying to explain this stuff, we're just going to go somewhere else, right? So we want a low energy approach to building capabilities within an organization. So going back to your point, you can't be a prophet in your own land. If you're in an organization for a long period of time, the impact that you bring kind of dwindles away over time. People are like, yeah, this may or may not be working. And off the shelf approaches, let's do Scrum, let's do Kanban, let's do these things. Yeah, those kind of have utility in the right context, but what really matters is building teams, team development, intervention, teaming skills, but nobody wants to put time into this. So bringing it all back together, the way you build a high performing organization is your leaders have to buy into this type of thinking. And it's a challenge to them because this is not what you're learning in an MBA. It's not what you learn in course. You actually have to go out and do things like fly an aircraft. You get to learn things from, team steps, crew resource management, things that are outside of your domain, and you bring them in. That's how this works. It isn't, you get to bring in consultants that are going to tell you the same thing about SWOT analysis and Scrum and all that other stuff over and over again. So you actually have to step out of your comfort zone and listen to somebody and go, wait a minute, that thing works at Southwest Airlines in the 80s, but it doesn't work now. Why is that? Well, because they stopped doing that, to be honest with you. So you got to find those people that are willing to step outside of their comfort zone. And that's in my view how you kind of get the organizations to start moving in a new direction.
Right. So a couple of things. I mentioned that when I was at 3M, and this isn't any proprietary knowledge, we went through 2 Scrum introductions. The first one, without naming companies, didn't take, and it didn't take because the managers didn't play. They wanted the rank and file to do that, but the managers remained managers. They didn't become scrum masters or product owners, and they didn't want to bring in experienced people to serve those roles. So they thought they could do it themselves. Didn't work. When we brought Scrum Inc. in, everybody had to play, and we brought in people who were experienced running it. And it took to some degree, but frankly, it stayed within software. It didn't really go to hardware anywhere else because there was enough resistance. But I think the other thing you bring up, Pancho, 2 other things is that, one, you have to want to change, but how much do you prioritize the willingness to change? And where does that priority fall in terms of available resources, dollars, and people to devote to it? And most enterprises I've seen, whether on the healthcare side or on the medical device industry side, position that fairly low. Up near the top, we're keeping the lights on and some of the other standard things, but not the more difficult change.
No, I see the same. One thing we did with Scrum Inc. and there's, so everybody knows Jeff Sutherland, the co-creator of Scrum, runs Scrum Inc. Today he's talking a lot about this, the things that we're talking about on the show, free energy principle connected to performance and things like that. So again, we're not doing any work with them, but in parallel, we're seeing those very similar activities, which is pretty interesting by itself. So what I ended up doing with Scrum was injecting the human factors side of the house, the team science stuff, and start leading with that. So rather starting with the framework, you start with the team development intervention work where you can, and you focus on the 20% that leads to 80% of your problems, the Pareto principle, the Zipf's law. Right. So if you look at how, and I think you've looked at aircraft accidents, and I don't know if the data are still correct, but if you look at why accidents happen in aviation, it's not because of a system failure on the aircraft. It's generally because
it's human factors.
It's a human factors thing. And the same thing in an operating room. And I think years ago that may have changed, where I think we were losing a 747 every day due to quote unquote inside of due to human performance inside of operating rooms in healthcare, or the equivalent of a 747 a day. So the idea is if you target those things that matter, and in this case, the leadership, the teaming side, the debriefing, the planning, the communication, creating situational awareness, all those things that we believe Boyd's OODA Loop can tell us how to do, if you understand it correctly, you lead with that. And that's what we did successfully and where we are today. And by the way, the research and science backs it up. You start with the human factors and you start to build real teams. One question to you about, coming from the medical community, are students, are doctors trained on how to work together as teams early on, or are they?
Okay. Yeah, great point. And actually, it was among my notes about the difference between the military and civilian. You're not trained formally about background history, how to work with teams, and leadership development is not part of the usual civilian development. Even for people like surgeons, cardiac surgeon, right, captain of the ship, you'd think somewhere along the way there might be some value in developing skills about leadership. Not. So again, can the civilian world learn from the military? Absolutely. There are huge gaps, and there's another side to that, and maybe you two have seen that, or maybe not, because you're on the good side. But the people I know who've had military backgrounds have a sense of self-validation that allows them to do almost anything in a positive way. But it takes a lot, and it's a much more individual, idiosyncratic journey for civilians to do that, and they're not all successful.
It's interesting. I wonder if where were the first medical school that teaches OODA Loop sketch? How would they accelerate, or even an established medical school bringing in, say, us to teach and understand the OODA Loop sketch to enhance and enrich what it is that they already, are learning for something that they're going to have to do.
Yeah. Well, it changes the foundation of learning in medicine. So, for example, what you're starting to see now in surgical training programs, that it's not numerically based to graduate from year to year as it once was, because cases are fewer available. So how do you develop an objective evaluation of performance to advance people to the next level? And how do you accelerate that? And maybe it's the same sort of thing when you start to realize that, in fact, it's not just individuals, but teams. So if you inject OODA in the bigger sense, and you inject team skills in the bigger sense, and how do you objectively evaluate that as a performance assessment that allows you to go on to the next stage? But there have to be profound changes in how we teach people in order to make that so.
All right. Hey, I want to leave, turn it over to you to see if you have any questions or anything that you want to talk about, anything you've read on the show, anything you saw, anything we can help you with.
Well, I think what you're doing is absolutely terrific. And again, as where we started, Boyd's work and all of the connections are amazingly resonant for me and have been for a long time. Mm-hmm. And I think that speaks to the fact that this is the reality of the cosmos. And this is a way of helping to understand and deal with the complexity and the changing challenges we see, the dynamics. And I think that the more we understand it, the more we apply it, the more we continue to expand it, is only a great thing. So how do we get the word out even to a larger audience? Because I think there's, as I wrote, but as I believe, that there is tremendous value here.
Yeah. Your paper, it came out in October 2024. Is that right?
Something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. So, and what kind of reception did it get? What kind of
feedback?
I mean, any comments, concerns? Yeah.
Not much.
No?
Not much.
Why is that?
And maybe that was the journal wasn't the biggest circulation journal. It was on LinkedIn. I had given a talk at an international aerospace meeting on Boyd, and even there, in an audience which is significantly military, space, aerospace, you'd think that people would be interested. And it was more like, oh, I've heard of that, been there, done that. Because I think that's I would put that in the case of that's the superficial understanding of the linear OODA rather than the bigger context and the bigger potential.
Well, let's do this. The three of us here, we know OODA Loop quite well. So let's come up with a game plan on how you could do a 15-minute TEDx or an hour-long presentation to really have high impact using John Boyd's OODA Loop. So, Moose, I want you to go first. I want to hear your thoughts on this.
I think the power of the article that we've been discussing is the universal applicability of it. So I could give it to any one of my clients, and regardless of their, irrespective of domain. I always try to drive that point home that the concepts that Boyd was basically tapping into and harnessing, these are not synthetic things that are man-made and mechanistic. These are trying to tap into the rhythms of the cosmos, for lack of a better term. And I think that's a lot of things why people push back or they rub on it, because they think, well, I can do it better. No, you can't do it better than the laws of gravity and the laws of physics and all the other things that he's harnessing. So I think there's that, number one. And number two is the point that I think we've talked about this a lot. Everything that Boyd is talking about is happening whether you like it or not. And everything that's going on in OODA Loop Sketch is happening to you right now. And you're actually doing this. And your lack of awareness creates the vulnerabilities of why eventually your place in that system is going to crash, because you can't adapt, you can't revise your models, you can't update, and it can apply literally to anything. There's no limit of what it can apply to. The only requirement is humans that make decisions.
And put another complexion on it. We worry about optimizing things today, but no matter how we get it for today, it may not be good enough for the future.
Right.
And we should be spending a significant amount of time on preparing. And these constructs are certainly, I know you've talked about heuristics, but they're part of the way to get there.
I think two things for me to really have an impact, and I haven't done this yet. We've played around with a little bit. Is maybe start with the mental health aspect of understanding that how genetics, culture, and experience can lead to post-traumatic stress, right? And it can be positive or negative stress. Those three components of the orientation drive everything for the most part. And they mix with new information. So you could potentially start a talk with starting with mental health, the impact on us, and don't even bring up the OODA Loop at all until maybe the very end, right? Another aspect is maybe start with how we perceive reality. The latest and greatest out of neuroscience suggests that our internal map of the external world drives everything. So, reality is constructed top down, inside out. It's generated by some world. Go back to your AI example there of a, what you call it? Not a 3D, but help me out there.
A digital twin.
Digital twin.
Yeah. So you have an internal. Yeah, so you have an internal digital twin of the external environment, and the map is not the terrain. So that new information coming in is only coming in because what you predicted is not what your sensory organs are actually receiving. So again, we could potentially create a whole, TED talk or a conversation about how you perceive reality, how mental health impacts us, and then reveal John Boyd's OODA Loop later on through aviation and go, this was never created around a fighter pilot. Well, by the way, from a fighter pilot perspective, you can use it and it's pretty powerful, and you can apply it for, a cell to a neuron to an organization.
I wonder
actually Gary Klein, Gary Klein has written a little bit about that, 20 years later, looking at recognition prime decision making. And he sees it as two parts, one of which is the experience you've gained that allows you to recognize something the same or similar to apply. But the second stage is that internal simulation.
Yeah. Yeah.
So,
So this is interesting.
That's orientation.
Cooper,
That's going on in your orientation.
Right.
So when we sat down, I sat down with Gary Klein 4 years ago to talk about RPD and the OODA Loop. And this is before I learned about the free energy principle and something very important, which goes back to that what if scenario you were talking about when aviators are flying, right? When there's nothing going on, what are you doing? Well, what they're doing is they're running a constant simulation. You're constantly planning, you're building a course of action. And for those of you who are not familiar, let's go back to flight training in the mid 90s. For me, it is when you're flying across country, you're always looking for divert fields. Where's next? What can I do next? What if I have to go over there? You're always running a simulation that you hope you never have to actually execute. That is already represented within John Boyd's OODA Loop, and we discovered that. And I wouldn't say we discovered it, but we helped make it more known that pathway that moves from act back to observe, which is internal to the system, is that simulation, the course of action, and policy. And that lines up well with recognition prime decision making. But at that point, when I was talking to Gary Klein, we were sitting down drawing this out, I did not know those connections existed. And I'd love to go back and talk to him about this, because today my view is RPD is already reflected inside of John Boyd's OODA Loop. And we brought this up before with not just Gary, but a lot of other folks. That John Schmidt, who wrote Warfighting for the Marine Corps, worked for Gary Klein. And we're not saying RPD is null and void. It's very, very useful. What I'm saying now is, when you look at John Boyd's OODA Loop from the lens of the latest and greatest out of neuroscience, active inference, predictive process, and Bayesian inference, it crushes everything that's out there. And it's a simple way to understand how living systems interact with the external environment. And that's what I believe would lead to a great talk about how do you understand this simple thing that can be applied to understanding psychedelic assisted therapy, to mental health, to how we perceive reality, to creating high-performing teams, to developing strategy, which is really dependent on your internal map of the external world, which most organizations don't have. And I want to ask you this: when you're going through your training as a doctor to do surgery, don't you have to have a good map of a heart? I mean,
sure.
Yeah, right. I don't know what the heart looks like, but you.
Sure, you obviously
looks like this, right? It's like shaped like that,
right? But there's also a learning curve, right? And and people learn most from their mistakes or their errors or their omissions or commissions, and that's certainly true of surgeons.
But you don't want a surgeon doing agile surgery on you, do you?
Well, so it was like that years ago. The great Denton Coolies of the world were inventing the operations at the time of the operation. Things have become a little bit more predictive now.
Yeah.
But you do want the recognition of what's different. You do want the novelty sometimes, to recognize the novelty and understand when you have to do something a little bit different, because what you're faced with is a little different.
Great points.
Do you find, I was curious, before I had a Wall Street background, and I found that every time you bring in Boyd or talk about Boyd, or you try to teach portfolio managers, investment advisory teams, even economists, I mean, we know this to be very valuable, effective stuff that helps you thrive in all forms of chaos and adversity. And there was a lot of pushback because, well, guess what? John Boyd didn't go to Harvard. He wasn't prepared at Exeter or whatever. He didn't have a PhD. He didn't have a tenured professorial position. All the institutional animosity against John Boyd. Do you ever run into anything like that in medicine?
Oh, sure. But by the way, I'm a bit of a Hawkeye, so he was okay. So
okay.
Boyd went to Iowa, right? So,
that's right.
So, sure. There's a bunch of that. Not everybody can go to Harvard. Not everybody who comes out of Harvard is any better than anybody else.
Yeah.
And I think if you have kids, you both have kids. When you're looking at colleges and things like that, you look at among the things. Well, what's the network? What doors does a particular
Mhm.
school open up in addition to what their offerings are? And that's a consideration. At the end of the day, it's the individual
Yeah.
that determines. But sometimes it can be a little harder route because you don't have the same network, same exposure. So, yeah, there's the same thing in medicine, and certain people when you come out of certain schools, you get certain residencies and things like that. I think the government's investigating that now, actually.
Yeah. Well, I think it's what's interesting to point out that was actually his starting point of what incited him to write Destruction and Creation, because I think a lot of his questioning, how is it that me, major in the Air Force with no doctorate, with no master's degree, with a full-time fighter pilot teaching lifestyle, with a family with 5 children, one with severe special needs, how did I do all this in my free time? How did I come up with EM theory in my free time without all that? And I think that was really his starting point.
Well, that's the to be or to do, right? So
Yeah.
he was the one who was doing it,
Yeah.
and that's not the way the entire world works, obviously.
That's otherwise we wouldn't be here talking about it.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, cool, Doc.
Yeah.
What a fantastic opportunity to kind of connect with you for the first time. I know we've been trying to do this for a while. I want to thank you for coming on No Way Out to share your insights on not just Boyd, but on how to be an effective leader and some thoughts on the healthcare industry as well. Any last thoughts or questions for us, or anything you want to impart with our audience?
Just to say thanks, and that keep up the battle, because I think again there is tremendous use and applicability of Boyd's theories and the connectivity that it leads us to. That we will only be better for it. And again, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks for coming on.